Your remarks, huh?
I couldn't believe it until I went, why in the world would we get a microphone? Okay, all right, let's get started. Thank you for coming in this weather. Is it snowing out, or I haven't looked? No, good. All right. My name is Mark Moore. I'm Program Associate in the Asia program at the Wilson Center. And this event is co-sponsored, along with the Asia program, by our program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, which we fondly refer to by its acronym as STAGE, because it's a lot easier. And Dr. Kent Hughes I don't see him here, but I want to thank Kent for his help in organizing this. Okay, the title is China's Galloping Economy, Prospects, Problems, and Implications for the U.S. China's real GDP has grown at 10% on average over the last 10 years, uplifting hundreds of millions of people from poverty. They haven't solved it yet, but they're going a long way toward it. Fareed Zakaria, in an op-ed in the Washington Post at the end of December, asserted that in 2007, China contributed more to global growth than the U.S., and this was the first time that another country other than the U.S. had done so since at least the 1930s. He added that in the last 2 decades, China has experienced the same degree of industrialization, urbanization, and social transformation as Europe did in 2 centuries. Now, when I titled this 2 months ago, it was China's Galloping Economy. Since then, the World Bank has come out with a set of statistics saying that China is not a $10 trillion economy, but only a $6 trillion economy, and it's 40% smaller than it was. Now, I'm not an economist, so perhaps some of the experts here can explain that. $6 trillion looks big, and as most people know, if something is fairly large and growing at 10% a year, sooner or later, mostly sooner, it's going to be pretty big. And we all know that China has hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. dollar holdings. And some people somehow say that that could be a potential threat to the United States if they dumped all their holdings. So it's one estimate that interest rates would rise to 25%. But since most people are not buying houses anyway right now, I don't know. And also, and we hear in Congress that, echoing the Japan in the 70s and 80s, that if they have an now it's, I think, last year, something close to $250 billion trade surplus in China's favor, that they must be doing something sneaky and cheating, because it can't be perfidious Japan or perfidious Beijing. That something's wrong, and there are various bills to force China to revalue its currency so we could be more competitive in our exports than they are right now. So what do we make of all this? Well, fortunately, we have assembled a panel of experts to explain this to us, and I, for one, am very eager to take notes and try to find out what's going on. A little bit more informed than, I don't know if you share with me, but I've been watching cable news and on our election, and you can't help but come away with the conclusion that there are all these talking heads, and they babble on for hour after hour after hour with no facts. It's all opinion. And so hopefully here, one of the sort of goals of the Wilson Center, and I'm sure other think tanks around town, is try to present some facts along with the opinion so that you can decide for yourself what you want to believe in. But I don't know, Chris Matthews, even let alone, we won't talk about Fox News. So anyway, so today let me introduce the panel very quickly so they can get started. The first speaker today will be Barry Naughton, who is on my extreme right. He is the So Kwan Luk Professor of Chinese and International Affairs at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, the University of California, San Diego, where we can all be assured the weather is a lot better than it is here right now. Author of many books. Dr. Norton's topic today will be 2008, Year of Reckoning for China's Economy. I'm sorry, that's a question. Year of Reckoning for China's Economy. Our second speaker, because he is not feeling too well and doesn't want to infect everybody, so he'll speak. We'll put on one of those masks. It's Jeff Logan. He's a specialist in energy policy at the Congressional Research Service. And he'll talk about China's energy policy and how that affects us. Then to my immediate left is Stephen Dunaway, Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific Department at the International Monetary Fund, who will speak about China's monetary policy. And last but not least is Dr. Cong Cao, Senior Research Associate with the Levin Graduate Institute of International Relations and Commerce, the State University of New York, and he's a specialist on China's high-tech research. And will hopefully answer some questions about, should we be worried? How long will we maintain our lead? How many years till China takes over? And other relevant questions. So without further ado, Dr. Norton, thank you.
Thanks. How do I get this started? Let's see. Here we go. All right. So my brief is to provide a kind of an overview and also sort of set the stage both for our other speakers and also to get a sense of what's happening right now in China. And so the way I want to approach this is first, very briefly, take a quick look back, then look at what's happening today, because today is, in fact, really just the last couple of weeks have been a period of dramatic change in the overall economic environment globally, but starting, in this case, from the United States. And then I want to argue that that these changes are going to present some very substantial dilemmas to the Chinese, dilemmas that actually they're not really very well positioned to address right now. So the basic message of my talk is going to be that we should anticipate that the economic turbulence which is currently starting in the United States is actually quite likely to induce and be reflected in considerable economic turbulence in China as well. So let's take a look at the current situation. I know the people in this room know a great deal about the Chinese economy. I'm not going to spend much time on some of the points that Mark Moore already mentioned, but just let's be absolutely clear that something has happened over the last 3 or 4 years in the Chinese economy that is really quite remarkable and certainly of a sort of world historical scale. And the Chinese economy has now grown faster, longer than any other economy that we have information about. And in the last 3 or 4 years, it's launched into this dramatic phase of very capital-intensive, industrial-intensive growth. At the same time, it's shifted the economy to a heavier industrial focus. I know that Jeff Logan will certainly talk about this and the demands this puts on energy. But the remarkable thing has also been that this remarkable growth spurt has also been due to a increased privatization and diversification both in the domestic economy and the way the foreign trade economy works. And again, Steve is going to talk about some of the macroeconomic aspects of this, so I'll skip over them very, very quickly. But the most direct impact for us in the United States has been in this very dramatic phase of recent growth. China, for the first time, not only did it dramatically increase its involvement in the world economy from already high levels to sort of stupendously high levels, but also for the first time China developed an extremely large overall trade surplus. Of course, in the U.S., we're used to thinking of China as having a trade surplus because the U.S. has had a deficit with China for such a long time. But as this graph indicates, until 2004, China didn't have a big overall trade surplus. It had a surplus with the U.S., but this was pretty much counterbalanced by deficits with other countries. Then after 2004, this dramatic surge of growth in China, exports continued to grow, imports also continued to grow, but simply couldn't match the expansion of the exports, which was so dramatic. And so the result is that China developed a very large trade surplus, almost 7% of GDP in 2006, something quite dramatic. And of course, as we know, the counterpart of this dramatic accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. Numbers were just released for the end of 2007. China has $1.528 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. So obviously that is not just much larger than any other country has ever had, but something really quite unprecedented. And yet, as China has gone through this dynamic and rather unbalanced growth phase, when we look back over the last 3 or 4 years, what we see is the United States was also engaged in an extremely unbalanced and in its own way dynamic growth stage, and that the combination of Chinese economic policy and U.S. economic policy was extremely beneficial to the world economy as a whole, right? Because the U.S.'s policy was exactly complementary to what China was doing. After 9/11, U.S. fiscal policy became extremely expansionary with the Bush tax cuts and the unanticipated expenditures following 9/11. At the same time, the Federal Reserve Board pushed down interest rates to historic lows, and innovation in the mortgage market led to an explosion in lending and in home values. It's not surprising that going along with this type of expansionary policy was huge U.S. trade deficits that almost exactly mirror, although of course in a much larger economy, the surpluses of China, because 2005 U.S. trade deficits peaked at around 7% of GDP. Now, we can say that these types of policy are unsustainable and dangerously imbalanced. And perhaps that's true, but we also need to look back at what happened in the world economy over the last 4 years, which is that the world economy has experienced a period of sustained rapid growth that spread to every region of the world economy. That U.S. and Chinese and Indian growth together touched off a kind of expanding circle of growth that reached Latin America, the Middle East, Russia, and even Africa, which has had its best 3 or 4 years in more than 30 years during the last period. And let's not forget that China played an important role in this global process, not only as a competitor for resources, pushing up prices of some natural resource goods, but also as a new supplier of manufactured goods, pushing down prices for manufacturers, especially labor-intensive manufacturers. So what we've been looking at over the last 3 or 4 years is yes, in some sense, a highly unbalanced world trading system, but one that happened to work out in a way that fueled the dynamism of the world economy and allowed acceleration of world economic growth without too much in the way of inflationary pressures spreading throughout the world economies. Of course, inflationary pressures did increase over the last few years, but all things considered, and given especially the energy price hikes, not too bad. Now, basic message of this talk is that period is now over. All right? The whole set of positive macroeconomic interactions are simply not going to work out in the future. Already, the U.S.'s ability to drive global demand was ebbing, along with the value of the dollar, which meant that the U.S. contribution to aggregate demand was shrinking. As Mark mentioned, last year, the Chinese contribution to world economic growth was slightly greater than the U.S. contribution to the world economic growth, certainly the first time that that's ever happened. And, of course, more importantly, during the last 3 months, but especially the last 3 weeks, it's become clear that the U.S. economy is going to at least dramatically slow and probably tip into a recession in a way that will significantly crimp the U.S.'s ability to be the marginal source of demand for the world economy. Now, what does this mean for China? There is a school of thought out there that says that China and India are delinking from the U.S. economy, and therefore that China and India will continue to provide a source of external demand that will keep the world economy on track, even if the United States suffers a pretty serious growth slowdown. And I'm going to argue that that is almost certainly not the case, that the ripples from changes in the world economic system are going to have an impact directly back onto the Chinese economy. Now, why do I say that? First, because China is already grappling with a set of policy dilemmas caused by the way that its economic policy has been run for the last few years. I know Steve's going to talk more about this, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. But the bottom line is, we would expect to find that a country with an undervalued and essentially fixed exchange rate would, in the long run, pay the cost for this policy misalignment through domestic inflation. The real question for China has been the remarkable outcome that dramatic productivity growth in China over the last several years has forestalled the emergence of domestic inflation until very recently. During the second half of 2007, despite valiant efforts on the part of the central bank in China to sterilize money inflows, consumer price inflation emerged as a serious problem for the first time in a decade. Now, this graph shows that China remembers well, in the mid-90s, what a period of rapid inflation looks like. China experienced inflation rates in the 20s and 30%, not only in the mid-90s, but even more tellingly in the late 1980s. In the period just before the Tiananmen demonstrations and the political crisis that followed, China had very high inflation. China's leaders are extremely averse to inflation and extremely worried about repeating that experience. They have declared many times that inflation above 5% per year would be considered a problem, would be considered outside what they are prepared to accept. Now, in that context, take a look at what's happened over the last 8 years. China underwent this remarkable period of price stability and even slight deflation. You can see from 1998, aside from one temporary spike at the end of 2005, inflation has been very close to zero for almost 8 years. But for the last 2 quarters, inflation has spiked up over 6%. It's a very serious problem for Chinese policymakers. Moreover, although there are many reasons why this particular bout of inflation has been triggered by a few key agricultural commodities, pork and grain, when we look more closely at the Chinese economy, what we see is inflationary pressure spreading to a broad range of industries and a broad range of sectors. And lying behind this, I would suggest, is the fact that the previously apparently unlimited supply of labor from the Chinese countryside is finally being drawn down to a level where the supply of labor is no longer infinite, where rising wages will be necessary to continue to draw migrants out of the countryside. So China is facing a whole new era of rising prices, and that challenges their policymakers in certain important ways. Now, given this new environment, what do we expect to see this year? All right, these trends are long-term. Right? China's facing a new set of reality. I expect that this year, Chinese policymakers will be severely challenged by external and internal economic events. First, externally, I think exports to the U.S. the growth of exports to the U.S. will slow and possibly even stagnate. And remember that China's exports to the U.S. are large and larger than they were a decade ago. China's exports to the U.S. are about 11% of GDP. It's quite significant. Of course, a lot of this in turn reflects imports into China, but those imports are also part of an interconnected web of global demand that will be affected by a slowdown in the U.S. economy. Second are dramatic fluctuations in Chinese asset markets, and especially the Chinese stock market, Of course, the Chinese stock market was down almost 5% yesterday, but it's also down about 23% from its high in October. And there are reasons to worry that a fluctuation in Chinese stock market is not simply have a wealth effect that can be tolerated in a rapidly growing economy. There are a lot of reasons to worry about the stock market in 2008. Let me just list two. First, a lot of shares on the Chinese stock market were in a restricted circulation mode. They've been converted legally to a new kind of share that can circulate, but when those conversions were made, they were initially put in a lockup period that for many of the largest firms expires during 2008. So there's a potential for firms to sell shares on the market that they couldn't have sold in 2007 that could add to any potential downturn. There's a reverse Olympics effect coming up. As people begin to see that the Olympics are close, the expectation that the Chinese government could prop up growth through the Olympics becomes less important. In fact, people start to think about selling out before some kind of post-Olympics effect. But really, all these things are minor compared to the bigger problem in the Chinese economy, which is that its enormous reliance on investment means that growth is intrinsically less stable, because investment demand is driven by fluctuations in aggregate demand. When aggregate demand declines slightly, investment demand can drop quite dramatically. Just think of investment demand in China, for example, for steel, which has been robust, but now that China produces 400 million tons of steel, more than that, a leveling off of demand will quickly lead to an end of demand for new steel mills in China and can push the economy towards some very serious turbulence. Now, all of this matters because Chinese policymaking lately is showing signs of extreme uncertainty. In particular, the Hu Jintao-Wen Jiabao administration has enunciated an extremely ambitious, broad-ranging agenda of social security and a rebalancing of growth. And this agenda has just been reaffirmed at the Party Congress that took place in October 2007. In some areas, we have to give them credit for accomplishing something substantial. In rural policy, they've done much better in lowering taxes, improving education and health care. But in other areas, this agenda is floundering badly. Rebalancing the economy meant cooling off an overheated economy. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Inflation is accelerating. It meant reducing this over-reliance on investment. That didn't happen. It meant reducing energy intensity and making growth more environmentally friendly. Little progress to date. And it meant restructuring corporate governance in government sectors to make them more competitive and more transparent. Very limited progress. In fact, when we look at what government policy has been in the last couple months, Jeff's going to talk more about this, I'm sure, but let me just say the policy has been a completely inconsistent pendulum swing between freezing certain prices, unfreezing them, trying to block inflationary expectations from forming. The result has been long gas lines and increased bureaucratic intervention in the economy. Why is this happening? Well, one important reason that it's happening is that China is undergoing let's call it a technocratic transition. Okay? While the Communist Party met and didn't change very much the people who were running the country at the top, we don't have the characters, I see, but that's okay. The actual economic policy is typically managed out of the State Council rather than out of the Communist Party, even though the Communist Party is the boss in China, as we forget at our peril. So we've got a new State Council. It's not going to be formally selected until March 2008, but we already know the outlines because it has to follow from some of the decisions made at the Communist Party meeting. And what we see is lots of new people. Even though the premier is the same, Wen Jiabao will stay on as premier, but the key economic policy makers are this next group, Li Keqiang, Zhang Dejiang, Hui Liangyu, and Wang Qishan. Except for Hui Liangyu, they're all new. They're all being brought in from the provinces, and they're all politicians. Now, at the bottom of this, is that a 1 minute sign? 5 minutes. Okay, good. 5 minutes I can do. At the bottom, we see a couple people who are technocrats. Ma Kai, who was the head of the National Development and Reform Commission, and Zhang Ping, who will probably replace him at the National Development and Reform Commission. But the remarkable thing is that this new state council is less technocratic, less skilled, and less experienced than the one it's replacing. It's true that at the top we have an especially dynamic set of political leaders. We've got Wen Jiabao and Li Keqiang, who, if they can work together, can be an effective set of political leaders. But more generally, what we've got is a lot of politicians and not so many technocrats. Now, it's kind of a funny outcome. Why does that happen? Oddly enough, it happens because of the way that political reforms in China, limited as they are, they're still significant enough to have some impact in the way the country is governed and managed. One of the reforms in China is there's a much greater regularity to the political process, to the way people are appointed and promoted. So there are term limits, two 5-year term limits, retirement, mandatory retirement ages for the top leaders at 68, and more predictable career paths, in particular leaders rotating through the provinces and then being promoted back into the central government. But the outcome of that for the state council, the head of the government, is that lots of second-tier leaders who didn't make it into the Politburo Standing Committee are placed instead in the state council. So we've got lots of politicos taking up the key economic decision-making portfolios in the state council. They're inexperienced, and their objectives are different from that of the technocrats. At the same time, the technocrats haven't done very well, and remarkably and ironically, one of the main reasons is that the Communist Party meeting relied to an unprecedented degree on straw polls and opinion collection among all the Central Committee members about who they thought would be most effective or who they most preferred as leaders. And I think most people here know the most important outcome of this, which of course was that Xi Jinping was jumped over Li Keqiang to be the main sort of designated heir, as we should say, of Hu Jintao. And that was a reflection of this sort of quasi-democratic outcome. But the point that I want to stress is that the technocrats did very, very poorly in the wake of this limited exercise of democracy in the party in China. None of the key technocrats who might have expected to move up into key economic policy-making positions did well at all. Both Zhou Xiaochuan, the head of the central bank, and Ma Kai, the head of the NDRC, neither of them was elected to the Politburo, and the main reason for this was because of the relative unpopularity of these economic technocrats. Chen Deming, who was originally scheduled to take over the NDRC, failed to even be elected to the Central Committee. So there's this odd blowback where this limited and inadequate form of democratization taking place in China, not only is it not good enough to lead to a broader democratization in Chinese society as a whole, but it has unanticipated consequences in making the economic policymakers less skilled and less experienced. Now, to try and deal with this, they've sort of scrambled around. Chen Deming, who was supposed to take over NDRC, is the new Minister of Commerce. Ma Kai didn't get advanced to the Politburo, but he can still serve as Wen Jiabao's primary economic aide, as Secretary General of the State Council. But look at the central bank head. Zhou Xiaochuan was supposed to either be promoted to vice premier, and he said he would retire as head of the PBC, the People's Bank of China. But the reality is there's no good replacement in line, and he's going to be asked to stay on, to carry on with policymaking. So the key group of policymakers is new, they're inexperienced, and the political dynamic among them is complicated and different. So I suspect they're going to have it's going to take them some time to get a hold of the situation, and this is not the right time. If we had to pick externally what's the timing where we'd like to see a new group coming in, we'd prefer not to see it right now, because as I've argued before, economic dilemmas are going to be especially difficult during 2008 as China copes with an external economic slowdown while it's trying to damp down inflationary pressures within China. It's going to take some very difficult and sensitive and decisive economic policy making. If we abstract from the turbulence, there are good reasons to think that China's trade surpluses will level off and might even start to decline during 2008. The combination of renminbi appreciation, which after all against the dollar have been 14% over the last 2.5 years, not great. Of course the dollar has gone down in value, but that limited appreciation combined with domestic inflation should begin to have the impact of increasing China's import demand again and moderating the growth and competitiveness of China's exports. What does this mean for the U.S.? It means really two things. Number one, that we should be cautious in our economic policy towards China in 2008, because despite our many complaints with Chinese economic policy, the reality is that still China, even given this risk of turbulence, the long-run story of Chinese growth is still with us, is still solid, and the growth of Chinese imports, remember 25% per year since 2001, is still one of the potentially strongest, autonomous, robust sources of increased demand in the world economy. And at this stage in our economy, that's exactly what we need, is confidence in continuing external sources of demand. But at the same time, we should be very cautious, because the risks of economic turbulence in China are great. They're much higher this year than they have been in the past. And although China's long-run growth prospects still are very, very positive, we should be careful. This year, the outlook is rocky indeed. Thanks.
Inspired by coming to the Wilson Center, Jeff has had he's feeling better. So he was supposed to go third, and he will go third now. And he doesn't, and I won't get infected, and he doesn't have to run away. And so, second, we're going to have Steve Dunaway from the International Monetary Fund. Thank you, Steve.
Let me see if I can quickly figure this out.
Maybe
Just turn it off.
exit.
Yeah, let's start over again. That's what I figured.
There we go.
Okay. So I'm gonna try to complement some of what Barry said. The basic thing I want to try to do is explain how we got to this particular situation with China's economy and some of the key forces that have driven the China in this direction, and then talk a bit more about the more medium-term policies that need to be put in place to bring about this rebalancing of the economy, which the Chinese leadership is looking for, and talk a bit as well about the very short-term problems, because I have a slightly different take on the short-term situation than Barry. But as Barry noted, as Mark noted, that China's gone through a very long period of relatively rapid growth, about 10% growth on average, particularly within the last 10 years. Now, it's largely been driven by investment, as this chart shows. Consumption as a share of GDP has actually come down. Now, this is not to say that consumption hasn't grown relatively rapidly. Consumption over the last 10 years has grown at an 8% annual rate in real terms. It's just that GDP has grown that much faster. And you can see that this big increase in consumption has led to substantial increases in capacity in a wide range of industries within China. And particularly, as Barry pointed out, it's in the last 3 to 4 years where we've really seen some major surges. Now, of course, this increased capacity has to go somewhere. With domestic demand not being able to absorb a lot of the increase in capacity, they've turned to exports, or they've turned to traded goods as a way of using the capacity that's been put in place. And particularly over the last 3 years, the most interesting thing has been not that exports have increased. The rate of growth in exports is hung in at around 25% per year in terms of merchandise trade. What's happened is import growth has slowed over this period. And what this chart shows you is where there's been a substantial amount of substitution of domestic production for imports. That in particular, if you look at basic materials, where they've switched from a net deficit to now a surplus, and the surpluses in electronics, in light manufacturing, these have all increased. So a lot of this capacity that's been put in place as a result of a very rapid rate of growth of investment has gone into the traded goods sector. Now, consumption, although it's been strong, hasn't grown very fast. And in part of it, it's because of uncertainties that have come into the situation in China. The bottom line. The top line in the chart for 2005 shows basically what's a kind of perverse life cycle effect, where you have older individuals saving a greater portion of their income, and it's a sharp contrast to the way the same kind of curve looked back in 1990. And the big reason for this change is because of what's taken place in terms of reforms, particularly reforms in the state enterprise sector, where a lot of the social responsibilities in terms of education, health care, and in pensions that the state-owned enterprises had were taken away from them and passed on to local governments. And in turn, the local governments have not necessarily had the resources to be able to meet their new mandates. And so the net result is increasingly the households have been called upon to provide an increasing share of the costs for health care, for education, and the substantial uncertainties with respect to pensions. And so that's led to a significant boost in savings. But it's not the big story in the last few years. As you can see, households, in terms of their saving as a percent of GDP, has not increased much over the past 5 years. It's been relatively stable. The government has increased its savings. The fiscal deficit has come down from about 3% of GDP down to around less than 1%. But the big increase has been in the corporate sector. And here, profitability has been extremely strong. And that's one of the things that's fed into investment. Their profits now amount to over about 40% of GDP. Much of the profit is retained by the firms, particularly the state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises do not, up until now, do not pay dividends to their owners, either the central or the local governments. There is now in place a plan to have at least some dividend payments be made by the centrally owned state-owned enterprises, but it's a relatively small part. So the big reason behind the very big surge in investment, and why investment in China is so high and has been so high for quite a period of time is there's a lot of key prices in the economy that are distorted. Land costs are low. Energy costs are low. Other utilities are relatively low. Pollution costs are low. But probably the two biggest price distortions in the economy which contribute to this is the cost of capital is extremely low in China, and the exchange rate as well is low. Now, the cost of capital in China is low in part because of the very low deposit rates in the banking sector. In addition, with these large retained profits of the SOEs, the basic cost of that in terms of cost of capital is essentially the deposit rate, which again is very low. 1-year deposit rate is slightly over 1%. So we make some very crude estimates of the cost of capital, and we use this kind of a very crude reference for the return on investment, real GDP. And so you can see that as you generally expect that there shouldn't be, and it's borne out by the advanced countries, the OECD countries, that there's not much of a gap between the cost of capital and real growth, or the real cost of capital and real growth. But in China, there's an incredibly wide gap of roughly about 8 percentage points, much wider than in any of the other developing countries. So the cost of capital is extremely low in China. And this has had the interesting effect of distorting production, so that in a country which has very large underutilized labor resources, China is a relatively capital-intensive production base. And this is seen in data showing real growth relative to the increases in employment. That China, with a 10% rate of growth, has been able to generate about the same number of jobs as the OECD countries with growth in 2 to 3%. Now, the cost of foreign currency appears to be rather low in China as well. As the chart shows, this is the IMF's measure of the nominal and the real effective exchange rate. And one of the key things to point out in this chart is this peak. Here, back in February of 2002, since that peak, both nominal and real exchange rate in China has gone down, and then is in the past couple of years has risen. But even now, relative to the peak in February of 2002. The value of the renminbi is about 5 to 6% below it. Now, over that 5-year period, if you look at a lot of the fundamental factors which we would normally assume that would drive the real exchange rate, in particular, if you look at relative productivity growth, the Chinese relative productivity growth has surpassed that in the rest of the world. So, virtually every indicator that we would look at would seem to suggest that over that period, the exchange rate should have appreciated, not depreciated. So the cost of foreign exchange, just like the cost of capital, is relatively low in China. Now, the question in looking forward is, and a question that the leadership in China themselves have asked themselves is, can China continue to grow the way that it has with very heavy reliance on investment? Well, the basic problem is you invest, you create capacity. So what are you going to do with this capacity? And this is an increasing concern, particularly over the past 4 years, where you've had very rapid credit and investment growth. That this will lead to significant overcapacity in some sectors of the economy. The overcapacity then, in turn, will have a negative impact on both prices and profits, leading to prices and profits falling, leading to new defaults on bank loans eventually, in a situation where you've just just spent a substantial amount of money to clean up the banking system. So it's very hard to see that you can maintain this very, very rapid rate of investment without creating further problems for yourselves. The only way out, and the way out so far, has been in terms of exports and being able to increase export growth or to substitute from imports. But it's not clear at all that you're going to be able to continue to grow exports as fast as they have over the past several years. You know, you're already talking about China is either the number 2 or number 3 trading country in the world. And with exports increasing at 20 to 25%, it would take up a very, very substantial portion of world trade to be able to continue to grow at that rate. And again, you face the problem, particularly in the context of a potential slowdown in global growth. The problem that in order to be able to continue to grow, prices have to come down, and that in turn will affect profitability, and that all is beyond the basic problem with respect to the potential for facing increased protectionist pressures in major markets for China. So the big problem is and as the leadership has recognized, is to rebalance growth in the economy. The immediate challenge is in terms to try to get control over investment and credit growth. As I said, over the past 4 years, this has been a continuing struggle. They've tried to do it to gain control through a combination of traditional monetary policy, but administrative measures to try to direct investment, as well as controls on lending. And you know, in answer to Barry's question about how they've managed to keep inflation down over this period, it's the controls on lending probably that have had the major effect on that, because that has contributed substantially to holding back the growth in credit in China over this period. So the way forward is they need to raise the cost of capital. To raise the cost of capital, you have to tighten monetary policy. To tighten monetary policy, if you continue to to tighten monetary policy, you can't do it if you continue to tightly manage the exchange rate, because all you're going to do is create additional problems for yourself. So as interest rates rise, you're going to attract a lot more capital in, and the problem is going to just get worse. So the only way out is to be able to rely more heavily on monetary policy, which in turn means that in order to be able to raise interest rates, you have to allow the exchange rate to appreciate faster. And this has the benefit of you not only increase the cost of capital, but you also provide better pricing signals through the exchange rate, so you get less investment going into the traded goods sector. Now, another key part of the rebalancing is the financial market development and reform. And here again, the idea is to raise the cost of capital and to improve the intermediation of savings. And particularly the improvements in the intermediation of savings. You know, the idea is to increase the access to credit for households and for the small and medium-sized enterprises. Currently, the small and medium-sized enterprises, which are a major source of both output and employment growth, they receive only about 10 to 15% of the lending out of the banking system. So they're forced to be highly dependent on retained profits plus whatever resources there are of their owners. So if you increase the availability of credit to these firms, then you free up. You potentially free up some funding for their owners in terms that can be used for consumption. Improved credit to the households also is something that could over time raise consumption, as well as if you increase the return on the assets of the households and the income from that source. Over the past 10 years, investment income as a share of total household income has dropped from about 6% to down to between 1% to 2%, and a lot of this is tied into the very low rate of deposits. And finally, the last major requirement is in terms of a change in government policies to provide better social safety nets, particularly in terms of the provision of education and healthcare services. But also equally important, or maybe even more important, is pension reform. The current pension reform in China is basically ground to a halt. There's only a very small fraction of the total workforce that's covered by pensions. But in 15 to 20 years' time, China is going to start to see a rapid aging of its population, very much comparable to Europe. So that you need a very substantial reform of the pension system now, and expansion of its coverage to cover all of urban and rural workers. And there's some simple ways that could be accomplished. So that's basically the medium-term policy situation. In terms of the short term, I guess I have a slightly different take on the situation with respect to prices than Barry. Inflation, is a very near-term concern, but it's more in terms of the impact on right at this point a few items in terms of food, and the concern is that more rapid food inflation and food price inflation spreading into other types of food, that will set off a change in inflationary expectations. And in that change in inflationary expectations, given the choice in China between assets held in banks and savings deposits where you have a very negative rate of interest, or goods, will lead to a switch of assets, a switch out of bank deposits into goods, and that will drive a broader inflationary situation. But over the medium term, I still see a lot of potential for downward pressures on prices as this potential oversupply situation that would be fed by continued very strong investment if they don't get a handle on it. Will have this have this impact of holding prices down, and that may actually end up play an even more important part in the context of a slowdown in global growth, because that will increase the competition in terms of shares of export markets among China and in particular the other emerging market countries in Asia, which are major suppliers to the United States.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, and now for those political scientists out in the audience whose heads are spinning with all these economic terms, like myself, we'll turn to China's energy situation.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I also want to thank the Wilson Center for putting on what's clearly a very timely and thought-provoking set of presentations here. As Mark has said, I'm feeling very under the weather today, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. I want to begin with a disclosure saying that what I'm saying today is really my own thoughts and feelings as opposed to representing the Congressional Research Service where I work. I don't want to get in trouble by not mentioning that. So, what I really want to talk today about, the title of my presentation is, Does China's Energy Policy Matter? And that seems kind of like a glib question. Of course it matters. How could it not matter? But what I want to try to show today is that even more important than the energy policy for China is its industrial policy. And industrial policy has changed significantly, or at least, as previous speakers have mentioned, the growth in especially heavy industry has been so strong that it's swamped all other efforts to try to rationalize or make more efficient the Chinese energy sector. And so what I'm really going to argue today is that, yes, Chinese energy policy does matter an awful lot, but perhaps more importantly, at least in the short term, is this industrial policy and trying to affect the tremendous growth rates we've seen in things like steel production, cement production, and all these other energy-intensive heavy industrial sectors. So with that in mind, what I want to touch on today is take a quick look at the energy-economic relationship in China. We've seen some pretty significant changes in that recently, and it's a very interesting thing to look at in terms of trying to predict what will happen in the future. And that's obviously very important. I'll put the Chinese energy sector in a global context, sort of comparing China to other countries, both in its the energy sectors, and something that Mark requested from us today is he wanted us to look at the new World Bank estimates on purchasing power parity for China. And as he mentioned earlier, China's economy has apparently just dramatically become 40% less large when measured in that context. So what I want to do is use that and compare China to some other countries in terms of its energy intensity and try to make some comments on that. Take a quick look at some of the environmental challenges that China's facing due to this recent surge in energy demand. And then a quick look at oil, and especially try to focus on what I think is a little bit overblown, this concern that Chinese state-owned oil companies are taking over the world's oil supplies. I think there's much richer fodder in the concern over Chinese coal and electric power use than the oil sector, but that will probably change in the future as well. And then look at some of the policy and administration issues, and then try to lead with some final remarks. So a picture tells 1,000 words, and I think this one is really, really important and thought-provoking. What we see here is the rate of change in China's GDP and the rate of change of its energy demand over the past 25 or 27 years or so. And I want you to notice three things. Number one, there's normally a fairly good relationship between how the economy behaves in terms of GDP and how the energy demand changes in terms of GDP. There's good correlation for most of this chart until recently, of course, as you see. And the second thing, that China's energy demand has historically been significantly less than its economic growth. The rate of change of the energy growth is significantly less than the economic growth, is what I mean to say. And the third thing is that it may be too early to say this, but it looks like, based on the last 2 years' data, that the relationship, the historical relationship, is beginning to return to where it's been. But what's really interesting here is just that these two circled areas, in the late 90s, Chinese energy demand apparently declined dramatically, followed by a period of very, very rapid increase. And trying to figure out why this has happened has been leaving many people scratching their heads. I would say that it's fairly well understood that this decline in energy demand, in fact, even into negative rates, is not that well accepted. I mean, most people now believe that those numbers, the statistics from the late 1990s in China, were not very accurate, that there were a lot of coal mines in particular that were operating and putting coal into the market under the radar screen of the statistical agencies. So even though we didn't see any real dramatic drop in the GDP, we did see it in the energy, but that's really what I would argue probably happened was that this line went something like that. And that has led into the current period right now of a really dramatic increase in the energy to GDP relationship. And that has been fueled, I will argue, by incentives that are in place to encourage investment, or maybe not encourage, but to force investment into in these heavy industrial sectors like steel and cement and aluminum and things like that. And what difference does this make? Based on the chart that we just saw, over just a few years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of energy that we believe China is going to use in the coming years. Thank you. Laser. Great. So in 2004, the International Energy Agency in Paris forecasted that Chinese energy demand would follow this line. A mere 3 years later, they revised their forecast based on this surging investment in Chinese heavy industry and gave the new estimates to look something like that. Of course, forecasts are only forecasts. They're only good for so much. They could change tomorrow. But in the end, this turns into a 50 exajoule difference in just a matter of 3 years. And that's enormous. That's half of the energy demand that happens in the United States right now. So this is very important. Here's a couple charts that show just what has happened in some of the sectors in China's industries. Here's a chart of the Chinese share of global steel production and a chart of the share of aluminum production. And you can see that beginning in 2000, China's share in the global markets has risen dramatically for both of these products. And for other countries, it's declined fairly significantly in some cases. So China has sort of taken over the production of these materials from other countries. And we see another example in this chart which shows the value added, the industrial value added. In other words, the contribution to China's economy of these different energy-intensive sectors. So iron and steel especially has taken over a much more important role in the Chinese economy, and other things as well. And it's not a question of Chinese factories and mills and power plants being less efficient. In fact, now Chinese the energy intensity from a physical point of view has continued to decline in China. So what has accounted for China's surging energy intensity has been a structural shift in the economy. It's not that Chinese plants are somehow much less efficient than they used to be. It's clear that they're not. I'm basing these charts off of a study that was done by Dan Rosen and Trevor Hauser in a publication they called China Energy, A Guide for the Perplexed, which has gained a lot of attention in the last 6 months or so. And in their paper where they present these ideas, they argue that the surging Chinese energy intensity is investment-driven and not consumption-driven. In other words, it's because China's building more steel mills than Chinese suddenly now driving their cars more or heating their homes more. It's not based on consumption increases. And that the increase is encouraged by land, tax, personnel, and environmental incentives. They argue especially that land is fairly cheap for a lot of provincial steel companies to obtain, and there are tax incentives for them to build steel plants, and there are personnel issues that are related to it. For example, provincial level governors will often be promoted based on how much foreign or how much investment they've been able to marshal in their provinces, and that they're rewarded really based on how much new investment and new big projects they've been able to deliver. And that this is the important part, that this has not been a central government strategy of the Chinese government to shift to this new energy-intensive economic growth. It's really been provincial level, driven by provincial level behavior. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. So just to cement home this point about the difference between industrial policy versus energy policy in China, that currently China has a goal to reduce their energy intensity by 20% in the year 2010. And if they're able to do that and actually continue extending it through the year 2015, they would be able to save about 25 exajoules of energy. But comparing that, pardon me?
What's an exajoule?
An exajoule is a large amount of energy. In the United States, we consume 100 exajoules of energy. So it's 1/4 of the energy use that we consume here that China could save. Compare that, on the other hand, to the recent surge in Chinese energy demand that's due largely to this heavy industrial surge, and that would be 40 exajoules increase. So the industrial policy is swamping any of the particular energy issues, any of the particular energy policies that the government's trying to enact. So now shifting to look at some of the comparing China to the rest of the globe. This chart shows the share of incremental global impact that China's had for oil, coal, energy, and CO2 emissions. And you can see that China's been responsible for about 1/3 of the recent growth in global oil demand, which to me doesn't seem that surprising given China's population and the role that it's played in fueling global economic growth. What's much more surprising is to see that they're responsible for 75% of the global increase in coal demand. And that's just absolutely mind-boggling to me. We see that China is catching up to the United States in terms of total energy consumed. I think the IEA is now forecasting that China will become the largest energy consumer in the world in the year 2013, is it, or something like that? But this chart just shows the absolute level of energy demand in different countries and the growth rates over the past 10 years. And we see that China's energy demand growth rate's been about 9% over the last 10 years. It would be much higher if it hadn't been for this period in the late 90s where Chinese energy demand apparently declined significantly. And we all know that coal plays an unprecedented role in China's economy, accounting for about 65% of its total energy demand. No other major economy in the world relies on coal so heavily as China does. And again, just going back to the oil comparison, China still only consumes 1/3 as much oil as the United States does. It's growing rapidly, as you can see. It's grown by, on average, about 10% for each of the past 5 years. But I'm going to argue later on that I think, again, that oil is an important issue. It's something that we need to pay attention to. But I think the coal and power sector in China is even more important. So how does China compare in terms of energy efficiency and energy intensity compared to other countries in the world? We often see pictures of very inefficient Chinese factories using a lot of coal, or we have an idea that China is not a very efficient economy when using its energy. And this chart would back that up. This is based on, this is energy intensity, meaning the amount of energy a country needs to use to produce its economic growth. So it's energy demand divided by economic output. And in this case, the economic output is measured in exchange rate, the 7.2 renminbi per dollar that exists now. And you can see that China is not a very efficient economy in this measure. But there is also, it's well known that using exchange rates to do cross-country comparisons, especially with developing countries and industrialized countries, it's not a good measure. So people have introduced the purchasing power parity comparison, and this is the old PPP comparison that I say old in the sense that it's been superseded recently by the World Bank's new estimates for China and India. But when you look at this measure of energy intensity, China does enormously better and is suddenly now as efficient as the United States, the U.S. economy, and looking pretty good. But 5 minutes, thank you. When you look at the new data that the World Bank has just released on PPP in China, the 40% reduction, Chinese energy intensity increases, of course, and is now, I think, it's a much more accurate reading of what the real energy intensity of the Chinese economy is. Certainly, China does have a lot of inefficient, old industrial, an old industrial base that it started from, but that is working its way through the system very rapidly with all these new things that are being built. And I will move on because we need to get going here. The World Health Organization and the World Bank have estimated that air pollution in China alone accounts for about up to three quarters of a million premature deaths in China each year. That's a very sobering number, I think. It's a very debatable subject and one that's pretty controversial. But I think we're going to see more and not less of this kind of reporting in the future. In the Chinese power sector, what we're calling here particulates are not as much of an issue in China as they used to be. They've widely deployed technologies in Chinese power plants to control particulates, at least compared to the oxides of sulfur and nitrogen, which are increasingly problematic. I should point out that in the past year, sulfur scrubbers have become much more popular in China, and there have been incentives. Power plants are actually running them for the first time, and so I think we're going to start to see a decline in sulfur oxide emissions in the future. But the rapid growth in urban transportation has resulted in most Chinese cities being covered in carbon monoxides and nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbon emissions. They're not pretty to look at and also not very good for you. But what's really dangerous from a human health perspective is the emissions from small-scale coal boilers in China, which usually have no environmental technologies on them. And the people who work around them are exposed to these very damaging, especially very small particles that are breathed deep in the lungs. We'll move on. I think everyone is aware of China's water crisis. In the north, there's not enough water. In the south, there's usually too much. And one of the big questions is, what will climate change do to this imbalance? Will it continue to exacerbate the problems? Especially what happens up in the Tibet area, where a lot of countries' water sources originate from melting snow. It will be very interesting to see how that plays itself out. Okay, very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about climate change and what the global challenge is of climate change. This is kind of a simplified version, but it will have to do. Policymakers are more and more of the agreement that we must prevent temperature changes of 2 degrees Celsius or more in order to prevent the worst damages of climate change. So if we're limited to a 2-degree change, then the world's must approach that sort of on this path. What the blue line is called the B2 stabilization path, and in terms of how much concentration of greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere that will allow that stabilization to happen, the global concentration of CO2, for example, would have to stabilize along that path, about 500 parts per million. Now, in order for 500 parts per million to be reached, global emissions will have to peak around the year 2020, within 15 years. And we all know that the industrialized countries of the world are barely making any progress on lowering their emissions. Developing countries like China and India and Indonesia and others are still experiencing rapidly growing emissions. So to turn this emission path as quickly as this is going to be enormously challenging. And just to show you how Chinese carbon emissions have changed in the past few years, again, we look at this 2004 forecast of what Chinese emissions were to have been, and then the 2007 revisions, which show an enormous increase in emissions. What's interesting, I think, is that even after China becomes the undisputed biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world, it will still take several decades, in fact, 3 or 4 decades, before China becomes the biggest cumulative emitter of carbon dioxide. And that's what's really important, because carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere for 100 years or more. So what you care about is not what was emitted in 1 year, it's what was emitted in 100 years or more. And so if you look at the area under these curves for both countries, the cumulative total for the U.S. from 1930 to 2030 is about 460 billion tons. And the cumulative total for China is only about 310 billion tons. So the U.S. has still got quite a lead on China in terms of how much cumulative emissions have occurred. One of the big drivers of China's surging carbon dioxide emissions has been the addition of new coal-fired power plants. And this chart shows, this is just for coal-fired power, but it shows how much new capacity China's added in each of the past few years. If you add up from the year 2000 to today, China's installed the same amount of coal-fired power plants that exist in the United States throughout our history. So I find that pretty phenomenal, pretty amazing. So very quickly, just there's a lot of talk about creating a new energy ministry in China because of this the recent shortages that they've experienced. And Chinese energy policy is it's very much experimental and pragmatic. It's probably characterized best by the old moniker of crossing the river by feeling the stones. And it's generally reactive rather than proactive, just because it's always struggling to catch up to the changing economy. I think it doesn't get as much credit as it probably should. Here's a chart which shows how much new coal or new electricity capacity has been installed in China over the past 15 or 16 years. It actually, what it shows is that the percent growth in the amount of electricity generated, which is the red line, and the amount of capacity that exists, the black line. And so you can see that in the late 90s, when China went into an oversupply situation, they had too much electric power and not enough demand. Anytime that the black line is above the red line, then you have a looming overcapacity coming. And then quickly, completely turning the tables shortly afterwards, whenever the red line is above the black line, you've probably got an imminent shortage coming. So China has, in this period, a very strong electricity demand. They didn't have enough, and they went into shortage in the year 2002 and 2003 and 2004, and that had some big repercussions for the rest of the world. Chinese energy policy is very much caught between the plan and the market. The central government control no longer really works or isn't available. On the other hand, market measures, the invisible hand of the market, is not able to help guide companies to do what the government wants them to do. So I also have here these two sub-bullets, that the central government's energy policy is overwhelmed by provincial industrial policy, and that state-owned is not the same as state-controlled. Many people think, especially with oil companies, that just because a company is owned by the state, that it will do whatever the state tells it to do, and that's very much not true. So wrapping up, here's just a view of the energy bureaucracy in China. There are roughly 8 ministries that are involved with the NDRC in formulating energy policy in China. There recently have been added due to these power shortages in 2003 and 2004, the government got so concerned about that it created a national energy leading group, and is, as I said earlier, is considering the recreation of an energy ministry in China to try to get more coordination between all of these different ministries and sub-ministry groups that play a role in this very, very complex process. Now moving on to oil demand. China became a net oil importer in 1993, and since then has seen every year greater exposure to imported oil, and it has become less secure, I would argue, as a result of that. What's really interesting to me is that during this electricity crisis in the 2003-2004 period, China's power sector had a huge impact on the world, even though it's not a sector that's integrated with the rest of the world. China's power shortage during that time resulted in the need to bring out for factories to bring out backup power generators that are fired by either diesel or fuel oil. And what happened during those years is that Chinese oil demand went through the roof, not largely, but a good portion of which was just used for that backup oil-fired power generation. And after China brought more coal-fired power plants and hydro plants online, the need for that extra oil diminished. So they stopped importing oil to run their backup generators. So very quickly, China's taking a whole bunch of measures to try to increase its energy insecurity. On the supply side, it's diversifying where it gets its oil. It's combining energy diplomacy and the national oil companies going abroad to buy oil assets in other countries. It's creating a strategic petroleum reserve. It's trying to substitute away from oil to the extent that it can. It's trying to maximize domestic production, obviously. And it's very interested in biofuels, although it's very interested in protecting food security as well. So I don't know how far that's going to go in China. On the demand side, it has, I think everyone has heard about tighter fuel economy standards. It's trying to reform domestic petroleum and power pricing, although as Barry mentioned, there's only so much leeway that government officials feel in loosening up oil prices to follow the true costs. It has a whole bunch of different industrial efficiency targets, including this 20% decrease in energy intensity that it's shooting for. This is just one example. This is the diversity, the attempt to improve the diversity of its fuel sources. And you compare 1996 to 2007, and you see that China's become enormously more diverse in where it gets its oil from. So, just some very general conclusions and discussion points. The recent growth in Chinese energy demand has been unprecedented, and it's really in our interest to try to figure out more clearly how that's evolving and whether it's going to continue. China's energy policies appear to be overwhelmed by transformations in heavy industry and the transition to a market economy. And then just finally, a question, how do we engage China? How should the U.S. engage China on climate change, industrial policies, and energy security? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Clearly a subject of another seminar. So now, Dr. Cao. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I don't need it. Yeah. I'm going to talk about China's kind of innovation challenge, by which I mean, because in the past several years, Chinese government has called for China to become an innovation-oriented society by 2020. In order to achieve that goal, I think there's some kind of challenge internally, externally, China has to solve. I'm going to discuss some of that. And in addition to that, I'm going to provide some kind of overview of what has achieved in the science and technology area in the past 25, 30 years. In some kind of sense, if I can quote Charles Dickens, the past 30 years in the Chinese history is the best of time. Internally, you have not seen any kind of dramatic, conflict after the Cultural Revolution finished in 1976. From China Opens Door initiates reform open door policy in late 1970s. China has experienced a very stable situation. Externally, there is no. International environment has been very, very friendly to China, and internally, as I said, there is no internal kind of conflict. Although there is some kind of short kind of period, like what happened in 1989, the Tiananmen Square kind of incident, and also very briefly in early 2000, in early 2002 to late 2002, early 2003, when SARS hit China. So basically, during the 30 years, China has very kind of experienced very stable condition. And during the same period, as all other panelists had mentioned, China has experienced very dramatic, sustainable, long-term economic growth. GDP growth has been averaged over or closer to 10% during this 30 years period of time. And during the same period of time, China initiated reform in every aspect, from economics to others. In science and technology, China started reform its kind of Soviet dominant system in mid-1980s, tried to provide better linkage between the research and the development sector, science technology sector with the economy, try to use science technology as the basic, the most important productivity to promote economic growth and development. In the late 1990s, another round of reform started, at which time those government research institutions became a target of reform. Basically, those research institutes affiliated to various government agencies have to redefine their mission, whether they are just provide public goods studies, research, or they are engaged in basic research, or for those more oriented to applied and development research institutions, they have to turn themselves into kind of corporations. And last but not least, during these 30 years, China has opened its door very extensively. In the science and technology area, we have seen the enormous number of students have been going abroad to study. And also China has started to cooperate with almost all countries in the world, especially in the developed world, totally turning the trend in the early period of People's Republic of China, when it only worked with scientists and technologists from former Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries. As a result of all these reform measures and policy initiatives, we have seen China has been on a very sharply rising trajectory to become science, technology. We cannot say it's a superpower. It's going to play a very important role in the world. Here I want to use a couple of indicators to see why I say that. The first is China has started to invest more money in science and technology and research and development. The latest statistics from China was that in year 2006, China spent 1.42% of GDP on research and development, and the total value reached 300 billion RMB. When OECD released its kind of projection early last year, in which it said China's gross expenditure on research and development was going to be reached 130 billion US dollar on purchase power parity term, which will surpass Japan, which in that particular year, 2006, only spent 130 billion US dollars on R&D. But as we already see our discussion in previous presentations, the PPP kind of value has been revised down by 40%. So even that's the case, in the Chinese kind of 1.42% of GDP spent on R&D is the highest amount countries with its economic development level. Although it's still lower, it's about than the level at the developed countries, which roughly spend maybe 2.5 to 3% of its GDP on research and development. The second indicator is that China has a very large talent pool. We have been talking about, or we have heard about, China produce such a large number of scientists, engineers. There are some kind of statistics here. In 2006, that's the latest statistics we have. China graduated about 36,000 PhDs, 220,000 students at the master level, and 1.72 million at the bachelor's level, of which about 170,000 are engineers. And the third indicator is Chinese scientists have published more in international journals. According to the latest statistic, Chinese scientists, the publication from Chinese scientists in 2006 already ranked at number 2 in the world after only the US. In those papers published in more science-oriented journals, cataloged by the Science Citation Index, Chinese ranked number 4 or number 5. It varies from different sources. So the share has been rising very quickly. As I said about Science Citation Index, back in the 1980s, and China's rank was only like 26. But last year, the China's rank rising to number 4. And during the same period, we have seen the dramatic foreign investment into China. We have seen those investments have been shifting from labor-intensive and kind of labor-intensive to more high-end, more value-added sectors. Foreign multinational companies have set up many research and development centers in China, especially by those big multinational companies like Microsoft, like Intel, like IBM, GE. The latest number probably will be more than 1,000 such kind of R&D centers set up in China by the end of last year. Of course, a large chunk of these R&D centers, so-called R&D centers, are just doing D, not development, just doing this localization of technology, develop their headquarters there during their mother countries. But we have seen an increasing number, as I said, of those leading companies doing really research in China. In the case of Microsoft, they set up its R&D center in 1998. They said they're going to spend $80 million US per year. But in the recent statistics, probably their annual R&D expenditure at this Microsoft Center in China alone will be more than 100 million US dollars. As a result of this, foreign direct investment, we have seen the Chinese society has become more sophisticated. We have seen more Chinese using cell phones via internet. The number of mobile phone users in China probably would be more than 400 million, 500 million. And the number of internet users is more than 200 million. It's only lagged in the US. I think in 6 months, maybe in 3 months to 6 months period of time, China is going to surpass US to become the largest country in the world in terms of internet users. I'm going to say a few words about China's innovation strategy. Back in the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, Chinese scientific community and the government realized research development is not enough. We have to introduce something called innovation. Innovation is not only research development. It involves more things than that. You have to have a legal environment. You have a financial instrument. You have a kind of institutional arrangement to stimulate innovation. You need this kind of intermediary. You need a legal reform. You need this intellectual property right regime to protect innovation. This kind of national innovation system, this kind of concept, was introduced by them. By the mid-1990s, the Chinese government initiated some kind of policy called strengthening the nation with science, technology, and education, putting science and technology and education on top of the government agenda of the development. That one actually was implemented by another policy initiated in early 2000, saying if if China is really want to become an innovation-oriented society, you have to strengthen the nation through talent. So talent has become a very, very important topic, at least in internal discussion. Early 2002, the Chinese Communist Party had its first conference on talent, during which the party secretary Hu Jintao said that the international competition in the future actually is going to be boiling down to the competition for talent. So 3 kind of initiatives have been launched in the last 5 years. One is called a patent, and the second is called standard. Third is talent. We said the same thing about talent. Let me just say briefly about this kind of patent and standard strategy. The Chinese scientists and the government realized, although Chinese economy has experienced a very, very rapid growth, and also Chinese science and technology has grown rapidly during the same period of time, but actually those products, those competitive products coming out from Chinese factories, Chinese companies, have very limited content of intellectual property rights actually created domestically. If someone said that Chinese companies, actually Chinese export a lot of electronics, a lot of refrigerators, a lot of computers, and a lot of some other kind of consumer kind of electronics products, but a lot of them actually are exported by multinational companies. By some kind of statistics, actually multinational companies, or those broadly say fully invested enterprises, actually contribute 80%, 75% to 80% of those so-called high-tech exports coming out from China. All these initiatives, strategies, policies end up with a big policy kind of document released by the Chinese government in early 2006, which actually is the medium to long-term plan for the development of science technology between 2006 and 2020. That medium and long-term plan actually emphasize a couple of things. The most important thing is calling for China try to build indigenous innovation capability. By indigenous innovation, it means three things. The first thing means Chinese scientists, Chinese companies have to come up with innovations with indigenous original creativity. The second thing is this kind of thing has to be coming out from China, so-called indigenous. You have to make improvement through those imported foreign technologies. The third thing of the so-called indigenous innovation is try to do the integration based on existing technology from various sources, regardless from Chinese sources or from foreign sources. This medium and long-term plan actually defines several quantitative targets. The first is try to raise the gross expenditure of research and development as a percentage of GDP from 2005's 1.4% to 2020's 2.5%. At that level, China's spending on research and development will reach the level of developed countries. The second thing is try to increase the level of contribution of technology to economic growth from 30% to 60%. Thirdly, the document actually calls on decreasing the dependency of foreign technology from 50% to 30%. The fourth quantitative target actually was try to raise China's rank in number of citations to Chinese authored scientific papers. As I mentioned before, although in terms of number of publications by Chinese scientists, China probably ranked number 2 or number 3 by various kind of indexes. But the citation to Chinese papers is only in that 2005. China only ranked 13th. So, but when this kind of targets was introduced, actually, the government, the scientific community, tried to say we have to raise the quality of research done by Chinese scientists. Lastly, a medium and long-term plan actually calls for to raise the number of invention patents granted to Chinese citizens. If we take a look at the Chinese statistics on patents, we will see the number of patent both applications and the grantee actually have been dramatically increased in the recent years. But a large chunk of that actually is coming from not the invention patent or the utility patent in the U.S. patent system, but in so-called kind of minor kind of improvement of existing patent. So the document actually calls to Chinese to be more creative. But as I said, in the past 30 years, China has had the best of its time. But at the same time, can we say that the period is also worse of the time? There's a couple of things I want to mention here. The first is about national innovation system. China introduced the concept in the mid-1990s, and various government initiatives indicate China has to establish a national innovation system which centered around the enterprises. Although, in terms of money, in terms of percentage of the money put into research development, the portion from the enterprises already reached the 60% to 70% of the total money put into the R&D. That level actually is equivalent to the OECD kind of countries level, where enterprises are the biggest investor in research and development. But at the same time, we have seen a large number of Chinese enterprises. They don't have money actually to do kind of innovative work. In terms of percentage, probably they spend less than 2% of their sales to do innovation work, to do research development. The second big issue is kind of intellectual property rights protection issues. Everyone in China, probably from the leadership side, realized China is not going to become an innovation-oriented society unless the country is really enforce intellectual property protection. But central government say it is one thing, but down to the local level, down to the provincial level, kind of county level, regional level, probably the story is different. A lot of violations, a lot of, enforcement cannot be carried out. We have heard a lot of stories. So the third thing is, although China put a lot of money into the research development, whether the money has been well spent, that's another issue. One of the things inside China has been talking about is that only 5% of the research and development money actually has been invested into basic research. But if a country want to become a really kind of innovation-oriented society, but that percentage probably is really, really low. And for the money side, there's a second thing inside China worry about is that a lot of work actually is repetitive, derivative of the work that has been done elsewhere. And thirdly, as I mentioned, you have a lot of papers, but the citation to papers is really low. That also is related to the money issue and also the quality issue. There's another thing related to quality issue is that there has been rampant misconduct in science in China. We have heard a lot of stories. The most recent issue probably is the front page coverage of the so-called Hanxin chip, which was actually a scientist in a Chinese university who bought a couple of chips from Motorola and then scratched the logo of the Motorola and put on his company's own logo on the chip, saying, "I invented something." So those kind of things is only tip of the iceberg. So, and someone said that probably this guy was just unlucky. He was caught. There are some more serious cases undiscovered. The most important thing and the bottleneck for me, at least for me, is the talent issue. As I said before, during the past 30 years, China has witnessed a significant number of its students going out to study. Some studies says it's like a little bit more than 1 million students have been going abroad for study. Given the large size of the students turning out from Chinese university system, the 1 million is nothing. But we have to recognize those 1 million actually represents the best and the brightest Chinese students. And of these 1 million students, someone said maybe 1/3 already returned, maybe 1/3 still study, but another 1/3 is working in other countries. In the case of U.S., National Science Foundation actually released data last year. It's in 2006 indicate, in which it says in 2003 there are 62,500 Chinese PhDs working in the U.S. In the U.S. workforce. Of them, most of them got their degree in the U.S. and also some of them got degree from other countries, and also alarmingly a significant number. I think a little bit more than 10,000 actually got their degree from China, and they moved to the U.S. work. Last but not the least change is whether China is still encouraging those kind of blooming and contending kind of let every one has its own view voiced. We heard a lot about some kind of internet restriction. You cannot access these kind of website. You cannot get those kind of website. Those kind of thing. Whether it's really a big habit of innovation is still way to see. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Questions, if you could, one at a time, and don't raise your hand again until more or less people have a chance to ask the first question. Okay, sir. And wait for the microphone. Identify yourself.
Yes, Raul Kohlberg, local scholar. One of the things that hasn't been touched on here, although only tangentially, is agriculture. The impact of industry, the drawing of people into the cities, the degradation of the environment, and more people in spite of a one-child policy that you have to feed. How is this going to succeed with regard to all of the other efforts that may have been made with regard to economic and industrial growth?
Agriculture. Barry?
Do you want to answer each question individually? Yeah. Okay. Agricultural growth has been pretty stable, and they're capable of producing enough food to feed everybody in China without too much strain. I don't think a lot of inputs into the fields and a lot of pollution problems, but I wouldn't anticipate a crisis of any kind.
Charter and freelance correspondence. For Jeffrey, China suppressed the cost of energy for the production sector. Could you comment this and how long it lasts? And also for all the members of the panel, why China not use their national saving, and particular the foreign exchange, to deal with their poverty and the health care and also the education, and particular the last speaker talked about innovation. I think that's very important for their future. Thank you.
All right, I'll begin on the question of energy subsidies. It's a very good question. The Chinese government clearly is struggling to balance the social needs of keeping prices down for things like electricity and oil, and at the same time needing to make sure there are no distortions in the system. In other words, if you're paying a lot for a raw supply and then processing it, a raw material and processing it, you can't then sell it at an even lower price. And I think it's fair to say that China's been pretty good at reforming prices and allowing prices to work at the international level, except for, especially recently, in the oil special oil products, and to a lesser extent in the electricity sector. Most people in China pay a lot for, gasoline is a little more than $2 a gallon in China. Electricity is about 7 or 8 cents per kilowatt hour for most homes, so they're not really far off the mark. Where there are distortions, it's aimed mainly at keeping inflation in check and keeping social unrest in check. But I think it's fairly well dealt with.
You want to take the question?
And the question on savings, they are doing some things in this regard, and in particular, if you look at the budgets over the last couple of years, there's been some dramatic increases in spending on healthcare and education. One key factor that's kind of constraining the rate of growth in the area is capacity to implement. That you can't just throw money at the problem. That they need sufficient facilities for educational healthcare facilities. They need sufficient people to man those facilities. If there's been a shortfall, it's been in terms of the planning to put in place the needed facilities to train the needed personnel, and that's the key area where they need to move. Because you're right, the resources are certainly there to deal with the problems.
And how about job creation?
Job creation, I guess what I would see is the biggest thing is to shift away from this very high degree of reliance on very capital intensive production, and the key there is raising the cost of capital. which will do exactly that. Will shift you back more towards labor-intensive means of production, which will generate much more employment growth.
Well, okay, all the way in back.
Zhuang from USITC. I have a question for both Barry and Jeffrey. So the Chinese leaders recognize they should shift from the investment-led growth to the consumption-led growth. It's for quite a few years. And recently they are recognized their saving structure is not reasonable, just like both you are put out. You say basically the enterprise have a lot of money, the government have a lot of money, but the people, the household saving is stable, and basically that saving is basically about 20% of the rich have most of the money. So that's the reason they cannot get the consumption growth. They recognize this, but what is the barriers or the obstacles for the government to take measures to trying to reduce the profit in the enterprises? For example, this year is starting to collect the profit from the SOEs, but only 10%. So what is the major reason for the leaders hesitate to take dramatic measures? I believe they know the problem, but maybe it's the investment, maybe it's the West interest group to block this. What is the politics inside the Chinese government to block the take dramatic measures to change this route of the unsustainable growth path? That's my question. Sorry.
Well, that's not an easy question. That's the sort of whole political economy of China. But I think we can say that. I mean, look at these policymakers. They unite under their somebody like Wen Jiabao, the premier, unites under his portfolio all of the different issue areas of government that in our system is divided up, among 3 different branches of government, and let's face it, he's completely overwhelmed. He can't possibly master this agenda. So on the one hand, you have these lovely sounding long-range reports that say things like we're going to raise the share of technology and growth from 30% to 60%, which is a sort of lovely target that has absolutely no relationship to the real world. And on the other hand, he's got a series of daily decisions that he has to make where he's got interest groups and competing people. Obviously, if we wanted to raise the consumption standards of the Chinese people, letting the currency appreciate or jumping it up 20% in one go would be a very effective way to redirect that saving from foreign exchange reserves into consumption and social services. Why don't they do it? Because they're scared to death that the knock-on effects of a one-time appreciation would be to trigger exactly the kind of turbulence that I think we're going to get this year anyway. So that's the best I can do in answering your very profound question. Steve, you want to take a crack at it?
The only thing that I would add, particularly with respect to the state-owned enterprises and the resistance there, is you have to remember that if you go back to the mid-90s when they were reforming the state-owned enterprises, they struck a deal with them that they got to keep their profits in exchange for no further transfers out of the budget. Okay, so the problem right now is undoing that deal. And that's what's kind of slowed it up. Now we've thought that there's a very simple model here that they could adopt, and you have a large number of state-owned enterprises that have publicly traded affiliates that pay dividends. So why aren't those dividends just passed straight to the budget through the holding companies that hold those affiliates? That's a question we have never really got answered, and it's a position that we continue to push, that the state should receive at least the same dividends as private shareholders.
Okay, right there. We'll move forward.
There we go. Okay, Michael Martin from CRS. It's interesting to listen to all 4 of the presentations, and there seems to be this sort of general tension, if you would, between how to look at, in general, China. whether on the one side you have a sort of proactive, planned, goal-oriented, intentional process going on, that the reform process was sort of planned out and whatnot. And on the other hand, you get sort of aspects of the presentations that the central government's reactive. It's solving problems along the way. It's taking it one stone across the river at a time. It's not really clear where they're going, but they're going there somehow. Let me go to a specific issue that would be more towards Stephen and Barry. Looking at this investment issue, it goes back to the deal that you're talking about. You've got state-owned enterprises and these private corporations that have a lot of retained earnings, and they have to do something with it. They can't put it. They're not going to put it in the bank. There's no real return on that, so they're going to find something to do with it. In the past, 1980s, when they tried to give wage increases and bonuses, they were told can't do that. They tried building schools and housing and whatnot. The government came in and said they can't do that. So they're used to investing it. So getting to the question that it comes around from this to me is, to what extent has the reform process effectively eliminated from the central government tools or instruments by which they could overall affect the macroeconomy, and therefore they're problem solving all the time? Or to what extent do you really think that they still have instruments at hand to effectively influence the economy?
Let me start. I guess I would see it exactly the opposite. They have all the instruments. It's just a question of whether or not they use it. The explanation that's often given is that they don't have a lot of faith in indirect macroeconomic controls. The leadership in China is dominated by engineers, and so they look at a situation where you've got, for example, very rapid investment, and it's concentrated in a few industries. Well, I say, well, there's good investment, there's bad investment. So why use monetary policy, jack up interest rates, affect all investment, and some good investment might get lost? Target the bad investment. Yeah, but no, but that's wrong, and you fall into the same trap that they have a tendency to too, because there's a tendency to look at the financing for enterprises is you have investment and you have working capital, and those two things are separate. Okay, and investment, they predominantly use reinvested earnings to fund investment. But money's fungible, and there's nothing that says that reinvested earnings have to be used just for investment. They could be forced to be used for working capital. So you jack up interest rates, you contract credit enough, you will affect investment, the same as you would in any other economy. The problem has been they don't want to go that route. Excuse me?
That's assuming they have substantial debt.
It's not a question of substantial. They do. Most firms do have significant borrowings for working capital purposes. So that they do have, particularly the large state-owned enterprises, they do have large outstanding loans, short-term, from the banking system. So yes, you can influence their behavior through that, just the same as you can influence the behavior of firms in any country. Now, the problem is, to do it, you have to raise interest rates. If you want to tightly manage the exchange rate at the same time, you've got a big problem. You can't really use monetary policy. So to make that leap to effectively use monetary policy, you've got to give up on the exchange rate.
Okay. Oh, no, that's enough. That's enough. We got to get out of here. I'll give it 10.
Victor Basser, consultant in national security policy. This is a group of economists, and he presented an interesting and, in a sense, enlightening economic analysis. But I would like you, as a group, to translate this into political terms. In particular, what does this mean for us as a superpower? I mean, for example, Dr. Moore at the beginning mentioned that the World Bank said that China's GDP is only $6 trillion and not $10 trillion. What do you believe is China's GDP actually is? And when will China exceed US GDP in real terms? And what this would mean to us in terms of exercising our influence in the world?
While you think about it, one of the first terms I learned when I was studying Chinese is I surrender. Perhaps the Italian.
Actually, the foundation of modern economics is Adam Smith saying that the division of labor is what increases our efficiency. And I think that's actually not our comparative advantage. And if you want to try and guesstimate, various measures of calculating China's political weight, that's kind of up to you. I would say if you want to understand China, the impact of China, you should start out with looking at its GDP converted at exchange rates. And purchasing power parity calculations are very useful for certain things, but exchange rates are there because those are the actual prices at which exchanges are made. And so I'd say, let go of trying to guess what year China's purchasing power parity adjusted GDP equals the U.S.'s, because it's not really very important, because power is multidimensional and economics does a lot of other things besides that.
Just very quickly, and I'm going to allow 3 more questions because we've run over, but there's a joke that the leadership of China commissions a study, and who's going to be the #1 world power in 2050, and the results are in, and they report to the leadership, and the head of the committee says, do you want the good news or the bad news first? And Hu Jintao says, well, give me the good news. And China will be the #1 power by 2050 and will clearly have knocked off the United States. And Hu Jintao says, well, that's such good news. Now, what could the bad news be? Give me the bad news now. So we'll all be dead because nobody can breathe the air. That's my answer. Okay, 3 more. Young lady.
I'm a little bit confused. I wonder how can China raises its cost of capital, appreciate its currency when it has to deal with price competition, and then I wonder how important maintaining its international competitiveness is according to you guys. Yeah, thank you. I'm a little bit sick.
Raise the cost of capital is relatively simple in terms of you raise interest rates within the country. The way that you're able to do that through monetary policy. Well, it's not just monetary policy. Also, because a key constraint and a key factor that keeps the cost of capital low in China is the ceiling on deposit rates. You take the ceiling off deposit rates, and you'll force competition in the Chinese banking system. And you'll get the banking system to start working like a banking system should. Right now, the Chinese banks are basically coupon clippers. They get a 300 to 400 basis point spread between deposit lending rates. They make big profits as a result. There's very little competition for lending in the system. So you move that cap on deposit rates, and then the smaller, more aggressive banks have a source of funding. They can begin this process of raising the competition. And now, as I also said, the key link is in terms of the exchange rate. You have to allow the exchange rate to appreciate to be able to use monetary policy. You also have the effect that Barry alluded to, where you get a direct impact on consumption as well, in terms of increasing the real income of households from the appreciation. Now, in terms of competitiveness, well, there are you kick off a lot of incentives to further increase the improvements in productivity in Chinese manufacturing. So that process itself would tend to maintain the competitiveness. But by the same token, you also open up the domestic market, and you refocus Chinese industry on the domestic market as being a potential source of demand, because in the long term, it's going to be growth in China's own domestic market, which is going to be the key force sustaining domestic demand, just the same as the United States. And that's the idea, is that over time you rebalance the economy away from this very heavy dependence on investment, on external growth, and more focused on self-generating domestic demand. And China's at the point where it could easily make that transition.
Okay, so Admiral.
Vaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Mr. Logan, I'm curious what the story behind the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Why hasn't China moved more quickly and more decisively toward establishing that? Is there some intrigue there or something?
I don't know if there's intrigue. It's a good question. There was a lot of debate in China during the, say, the late 1990s and early 2000 period about whether a strategic petroleum reserve was even suited for China. That they would have to spend billions and billions of dollars and perhaps not even achieve any increased energy security from it. But where things stand right now, there are 4 areas where they're building reserves. One of them is complete and has actually begun to stockpile oil, and the other 3 are under rapid development. The problem is, right now, with prices so high, the government is very reluctant to publicly, anyway, announce when it's going to start stockpiling because of the impact on global markets that even the announcement might have. So they're being very, even more intransparent than normal in talking about how those reserves are being filled. But, the International Energy Agency in Paris is having a pretty robust dialogue with China on how to set up their reserves, what they're trying to accomplish by doing it, and hopefully they're going to convince the Chinese to operate the reserves in conjunction with the rest of the world's stockpiling, because that's where you get the public good for everyone. And if China doesn't participate and use its SPR in the same way that other countries are using it, then it really won't have a global benefit. So that's the real issue, I think, right now.
Okay, last question.
Parameswaran from Agence France Press. Just a question to Mr. Dunaway and Mr. Norton. How would the economic problems in the United States, magnified by financial sector turbulence recently, affect China, for example, against the backdrop of what you all said? And if you can go a bit further to Asia, for example, how are these problems going to really affect the region?
I guess in a way I've already tried to declare myself on that and just say that I think it'll have a big impact. And to be honest, we just don't know. Events are evolving so quickly. But, I mean, there are several different transmission mechanisms, and disentangling them is really difficult. There's definitely going to be a real transition mechanism where China's exports will take a hit. Now, how big a hit, we don't know. There's a financial transition mechanism. The Bank of China has announced significant losses related to the U.S. mortgage markets. I'm sure, maybe Steve has some insight into this, that the official Chinese reserves, there's some share in mortgage-related securities. They don't have to declare, they don't have to mark to market, so they don't ever have to tell us, but I'm sure they've taken some significant losses. So there's lots of transmission mechanisms, and I think we're just beginning to see the seriousness of this and try and disentangle how it works.
I agree with what Barry says. On the housing related, in terms of official reserves, there's nothing. There's nothing there. The only housing related securities they hold are Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae, Freddie Mac securities, because those are the only things that qualify as a reserve asset. On the banking system as a whole, from the Treasury International Capital reports, we would estimate that there's maybe something on the order of about $12 billion in non-government mortgage-backed securities held by Chinese banks, of which about $8 billion is held by the Bank of China. And the write-down that Barry is talking about, with $8 billion in the portfolio, it's not going to be a huge hit to the Bank of China that it's going to have a tremendous effect. So it would be hard to see where a lot of, and China is relatively separated from the rest of the world in terms of financing. Okay, so big financial impact on China would be hard to see. Maybe it would have some impact with respect to foreign direct investment that might slow a bit. The one thinking is that the slowdown in the U.S. does take a little bit of the heat potentially off of the leadership this year. That it may contribute to some slowdown in investment growth, and so that they don't need as much in terms of policy action to be able to slow that investment growth. So that would be a short-term benefit that would come out of it, but it's just a very short-term benefit. It still doesn't deal with the basic problem that they have. Across the region, the impacts are going to deviate substantially. China, we would expect, will be able to keep growth up somewhere between 9 and 10%, and that would be done by easing up on some of the restraints on investment, combined with probably raising government spending, particularly on infrastructure investment to keep GDP up. It would have kind of mixed impacts across the region, where North Asia would be okay. Japan, Korea would get a little bit of a stimulus to offset the impact from the U.S. from investment goods going to China. Much more of an impact in Southeast Asia, where they're a combination of suppliers of intermediate products for export from China. And they're also direct competitors in a number of products. Those countries will probably face a much tougher time with the slowdown in the U.S. and probably some extra competition from China for smaller world markets.
Can I ask Steve a quick question? Steve, I don't quite understand the interaction here where you say there's this danger, and I agree with you, there's all this excess capacity, and so there's the potential that this excess capacity has significant downward pressure on Chinese and global prices. Mm-hmm. And yet now you're saying, well, a little bit of reduction in U.S. demand takes the pressure off the growth process.
It takes some of the pressure. It takes some of the pressure off.
Yeah, but
it doesn't take it all off.
If there's a turning point and we have this excess capacity released onto the market,
yeah,
that's a very difficult situation to deal with.
Well, it's a difficult situation domestically for the Chinese to deal with, and in the world markets. The question is in terms of how much investment is in train, and how much will go in place even with the slowdown in the U.S. There's still a big, strong push domestically because with the changeover in the government, everybody wants to get off to a strong start. So even if world markets kind of soften up, there still is this domestic push to put more investment in place. So you've got kind of mixed forces that are working. I think it takes some of the heat off, but it doesn't solve this basic problem. This very heavy reliance on investment will generate this excess capacity over time.
Okay. Not being an economist, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but what do I know? Anyway, with that, I think the panel will stay for a while if you have follow-on questions. Thank you all for coming. Barry